Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Can you hear me? Do I have to go closer?
No.
You're doing fine.
Sonia gave me this booklet from an older couple, quote unquote, who were cleaning out their home, and they found this publication, which I think is Luther's Catechism in German and English, and she wondered what I should do with it, and I said I could pass it around this morning. I always love Reformation Day, and not only because it brings out people in red. I don't have a red thing in my closet, or I would join you. But it's rather nice to see not just the sweaters and the shirts and the paraments at the altar, which are very stunning, but the hymns we sing, some old barn burners. The church's one foundation is a great one to bring out at the beginning of a Reformation service, and then of course also A Mighty Fortress, which I noticed was arranged by Michael Costello, who's the music director at Grace River Forest, and monthly directs motets from Bach throughout the year. There are probably a lot of other reasons why we might choose to celebrate Reformation Day or remember Martin Luther. And I think that's an interesting thing, given that we are one of those denominations which ended up with the name of the reformer or the founder of a denomination like ours. There are many who would say within the Lutheran Church that we really should not celebrate Reformation Day, because after all we have become a ecumenical body, this body called Christendom, and we ought to celebrate our oneness rather than looking back into the past and remembering things that maybe people should have forgotten years ago. So there are lots of reasons why we come together. I have one reason I thought worth remembering, and that is years ago I was pastor of a church in Itasca, Illinois. Anybody know where that is? It's a western suburb of Chicago. And I was holding an adult instruction class, which I think had been somehow advertised in the local media. And a woman came to that class. I did not know her. She was an African-American woman. And she listened during the comments that were made, and all of a sudden she said, "Wait a minute." She said, "Are we talking about Martin Luther King or not?" And I said, "No, we're talking about Martin Luther." And she said, "Well, then I'm going to have to go home and rethink this whole thing." So there are many things that people think about when they think about Martin Luther. They may name streets, they may name people like Martin Luther King after Martin Luther. I wonder, when you think about Martin Luther, what are some of the things that you think about? Positive things, negative things, anything at all. Let's just remember something.
Music.
Music. Okay, we had a motet this morning I had never heard before, which non moriar sed vivam, I shall not die but live, said the psalm, and Luther composed that as a motet. I had never heard that until this morning, but it does bring back a wonderful memory. When I was a first-year seminarian, a man was brought from Australia who had a great history behind him. His name was Hermann Zersen in German, and he was one of the great theologians of Europe who had left just before Hitler took power because he saw what was coming. And he went to Australia, where he lived for a while, and then he was brought to the United States, and he was going to give this class at the seminary. We seminarians didn't know really who he was, but he began his lecture with those very words, non moriar sed viva. And we thought, impressive Latin. We didn't really know for sure what he was saying. I shall not die but live. And he was old at the time, so we figured that was a good thing, because he might finish the course. He went on back to Australia, died in a terrible house fire, and is remembered today as one of the great Lutheran theologians of the church. So music. Other things that come to mind when you think.
The first time he met the Pope.
The first time he met the Pope.
And his shock.
Went to Rome. Yes, ma'am.
Table talk.
Table talks. Okay, in German the word is Tischreden. Table talk. In English, there are 6 volumes of table talk. In the original Weimar Ausgabe, the German version, we have only one in the American edition. It's what Luther babbled on when he sat at table with students and relatives who had come to visit, and all the people that Katie had to cook for. And they would write down everything he said. Table talk.
Confirmation class?
Confirmation class.
And Luther's catechism.
Luther's catechism. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
95 theses.
95 theses, okay? As the story goes, nailed onto a door at the Castle Church in Wittenberg. Many scholars question whether that actually took place in that way, not whether the theses were written or whether they still are available today, but whether they actually got nailed to the door. Yes, ma'am.
Grace and forgiveness.
Grace and forgiveness, wonderful words in our heritage. Any other things that come to mind?
He drank a lot of beer.
He drank a lot of beer, and when he was dying of some kidney problems, the doctor advised more beer in the hopes that the stones would pass. Other
German Bible.
German Bible. Okay, he spent a lot of time in the Wartburg writing translating the Bible. Any other things that come to mind?
His feelings about the Jews.
Feeling about the Jews, okay? We moved from positive to a negative side. Thank you for bringing that up, and we'll talk some more about that. Yes, ma'am.
This is a positive back real quick. The words to A Mighty Fortress were written, some of them were spoken on his deathbed as he died.
Okay, that the words which he had written in 1521 for A Mighty Fortress were spoken at his deathbed.
By him.
Okay.
And his death?
I didn't even know that. I know his final words are supposed to have been, "We are beggars all." Yes, sir.
My musician daughter tells me that Luther was the one who said you sing all the verses. I didn't realize that until I joined this church that was the deal.
It can be frustrating at times. We've talked a lot about Luther. Anything about his wife?
Catherine.
Catherine. Katie.
A saint.
Saint. She put up with it. She was a nun. Some other things to remember, just a few things as we think about Reformation Day, about all the things that transpired as a result of the nailing of the 95 Theses, or however it was done. The actual day, this coming Tuesday, so we celebrate it today. The 95 Theses are really filled with talk about simony, nepotism, usury, indulgences. Just say a couple things about each of those, because some of the things that we will talk about, negative sides of Luther, about things he said, had nothing to do with those, really. Simony is a term that was used for the practice of using money to give people positions of power. So in the book of Acts, there was a man by the name of Simon Magus, and he wanted to give money to the apostles so that they could give him the power to do certain kinds of things with respect to the Holy Spirit. And ever since, it was known as a way of dealing with people's lives through money. Nepotism, the charge that you gave your nephew a position at the bank, or that you made your son, you required that the community elect your son to be mayor following your term of office. Those kinds of things, that's nepotism. Usury generally has to do with charging too much interest. What is the actual required amount isn't said, but often terribly high amounts of interest were charged. And the Germans accused the Jews of doing that, and that was one of the issues that were involved during the day. And indulgences, the practice of paying your way, that was the negative charge. So the positive side of it was you were giving money to a local charity, just like we might do today. The negative side was that you were buying your way into heaven by giving your money to a local charity, namely the local church, or even the elector, the ruler, for things that he might do with it. All of that called for a debate, and that's what Luther really wanted to do. The results of all of this were surprising and challenging to Europe. Luther became a name that was known by everyone, regardless of whether they followed him or not. The two big issues that happened were the split that took place in the church in 1521. So the Edict of Worms, which was passed by the emperor at the famous Diet, which said that not only could Luther be killed by anyone, but this was forbidden to teach this kind of theology. And then not long thereafter, some 30 years thereafter, after terrible strife had taken place and people were battling against one another, the so-called Peace of Augsburg, where they agreed not to continue to battle for a period of time. The two issues that they were wrestling with, what was the authority in the church? I mean, we have come to say, following Luther, who didn't have a lot of interest in, say, the authority of bishops and rulers, but was more concerned with the communion of the saints, the communio sanctorum, the fact that all of us together can speak about what it is that we should believe and what it is that we should practice. And that was challenging to those who believed that from the top on down, authority was given and you knew what you had to believe because it was told to you. And justification by faith, which was a revolutionary kind of thought, because you were acceptable before God, not because of anything that you did, but because of what God had done and because of your trust in that. Terrible consequences that resulted from all of this for Europe, just very quickly, the peasants' revolt, where some 100,000 people died, and Luther was accused of taking the side of the peasants, so that forever after, that's one of the problems that we have when we take a look at wars and the Lutheran view of war. People often point to Luther's views during the Peasants' Revolt in that he negated those who were rising up against authority. And the 30 Years' War, which took place after his death, about 8 million people in Europe died, the Catholics and the Lutherans fighting against one another. Positive implications, that's worth a whole presentation, but the growth of science and politics and literature and philosophy were enormously impacted by what took place in the Reformation. Let's just bring that up to date and say some things about what's taking place and has taken place with respect to the Reformation and its impact on the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church. In 2016, Martin Junge, who was the president of the Lutheran World Federation, met with Pope Francis. And there you see them in the Lutheran Cathedral in Lund, Sweden, and they were signing a document that they would work together for the first time ever physically present. And 1 year later, Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, agreed that he would participate, or that the Anglican Church would participate in that discussion, debate. And there are a lot of additional reasons why we might celebrate what has taken place since the Reformation. The reforms that have taken place in the church sometimes are debatable, sometimes are challenged by individuals and groups, and so we're never quite sure whether we're all together or not, but some of it we have to regard as positive. The societal impact of Luther's Here I Stand, I think, is quite profound. When you think about it, in fact, I wish that our speaker a couple Sundays back, Dr. Wenger, would have talked about that, because he wrote much about Luther's wrestling with conscience and conscience before God, the position that you take when you take a stand because your conscience before God is requiring you to. That's a big debate that a lot was published on, that Wenger had to do with. But the implication of that for our society today is interesting. If you are, let's say, a person who is deciding whether or not he wants to be, she wants to be a soldier, and you reject that, and by saying that you don't believe in war or you don't believe in battle, and so you're a conscientious objector, that goes back to Luther's stand at Worms. That's a conscientious objection. And while it's controversial in many circles, it's nevertheless something that is a piece of this debate that Luther started for us. The whole political implication of personal freedoms. Maybe we in the United States experience that more than anyone else, where people, I think about it in reference to the big COVID stands that people took, saying, I'm free, I can do anything I want, I don't have to take a vaccination. So it was the whole idea of freedom, which Luther championed beginning at Worms, has become a problematic stand in many respects. And I think that even though there are positive sides to be able to say we are really thankful to Luther for that moment, nevertheless it brings up lots of other challenges. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Educational implications of general schooling, for example, a big issue for Luther and for Melanchthon, who followed him. Today at Columbia University, there's a big statue of Melanchthon hanging up there, celebrating him as one of the founders of public education. The use of the printing press, It's clear that Luther would never have made the impact that he had made had Gutenberg not, at that time, made the printing press a possibility. The emphasis on the Christian family was enormous for Luther after he took this controversial stand and married a nun and had 6 children and celebrated his family life and encouraged other pastors to get married. And there were pictures of Luther as a family man being printed by Gutenberg's press and sent all over Europe so that people thought family life was something really to think about positively. Despite all of those positives, today we're going to talk about Luther's language and his emotional feelings which produced language which we would probably consider offensive in our living rooms or being said by some people who are in our circles of friends. But Luther said interesting things about them. I love some of these statements. My enemies assailed me so atrociously that they carried me in my use of language beyond the bounds of moderation. Now that's a lovely statement. But the truth is that it was sometimes just quite foul. Luther took his opportunity to debate a lot of people. He said things about the Pope even we who are Lutherans today would not say about human beings in general, about colleagues with whom he disagreed. Erasmus, he said brutal things. The Turks, Lord, keep us steadfast by your word, was mentioned by Pastor Karen in the sermon this morning. That was a hymn for children. And in it, Luther asked them to defy the Turks. The word typically used for the citizens of the Ottoman Empire and the people who were striving to move further and further north, capturing Vienna and then ultimately all of Europe. That was the dream. The Thuringians, the Saxons, the Wends, I'll say some things about that because I probably know more about that than most people. Citizens of Wittenberg themselves, he considered Wittenberg a hovel, and members of St. Mary's Church, who he considered sometimes kind of stupid. I have often tried to serve the world with outward dignity and holy seriousness, but God has not allowed it. Another wonderful statement. Well, these are some things that Luther said just on a Tuesday morning, could have been a Thursday. But the fact is, if you read through the volumes of Luther, 55 volumes in the American edition, in the original Weimar edition, the German edition, there were 120 volumes, but in addition to the volumes which are now translated in English, you had 6 volumes of Tischreden, more than we have in the English, and you had, I'm drawing a blank on some of the other volumes which were published in the German edition, but the percent of those that might have dealt with very specific kinds of negative vocabulary, crude language, is small, but I have heard people say, given what Luther has said about the Jews, for example, and we'll show what he's had to say, I want nothing to do with the Lutheran Church. Okay, but it's good to know what he said about the Jews, and it's good to know what he said about the Wends, and about the Turks, and about all kinds of people, because then if people make statements like that, we can say, yeah, I know all that too. Because a lot of Lutherans don't. But if you can say, I know all that too, you can also realize that that's a small portion of what he said and who he was, and that what we have to attribute to him was far more profound at other positive levels. I don't need to read all those for you, but I think you can see that sometimes he just spouted off. I'm going to say something about the winds. Quickly, I have to say how I got into that. So I became a president of a university in Austin, Texas, that was founded by Wendish people. Most people don't know who they are. And I remember asking somebody, because I didn't either when I got there, I said to a man at a gathering that we had at our home, well, so who really are the Wends? And he said, well, they're sort of like the Germans. Well, that was totally false, because he was a Wend. And the sad thing was that he didn't know any better. In Germany today, the scholars say Sorbs, S-O-R-B, has nothing to do with Serb, S-E-R-B, but the words sound similar. Sorb and Wend are interchangeable depending on where you find yourself. When these Slavic people, they were not German, they were Slav, immigrated to the United States and primarily to Texas, some to Iowa, some to Canada, some to South America, some to South Africa, but primarily to the United States and to Texas. They had come from a place in Germany today. Up here north would be Berlin, and over here is Dresden. So between Berlin and Dresden is the area where the Sorbs and the Wends live. Just south of Dresden is Weimar, and I knew a young man from Weimar who came to study in the United States. And when I talked about the Wends, he said, "Boy, you're just kidding. That's a fable. You're making that up. There is no such thing as Wends." Well, that was embarrassing that he should be so stupid, because they comprise a large section of Germany today, but there are only about 30,000 who still speak Wendish or Sorbian. And in the United States, all those who came speaking Sorbian in 1926, they no longer speak Sorbian. It's only in Europe do they. And the distance between the Sorbian territory and Wittenberg was approximately 40 miles today. But in Luther's time, they had moved into Wittenberg. So Luther said things about them which were not particularly nice. There is a debate as to whether Katie was a Sorb or a Wend. And she was, as you may know, Catherine von Bora. Bora is Wendish for pine tree. So there's a question as to whether it's possible that Cato was Wendish and that Luther was making smart aleck remarks all the time when the table talk people who were writing like crazy wrote down things he said about Wends, knowing that Cato was over by the stove cooking and she heard it. But they got to write it down for history and we no longer know the context. He would say things like Bohemians, the Czech people today, gobble their food, the Wends steal, and the Germans get drunk. And only the drunken, boorish, and hypocritically pious live in Wittenberg. In other kinds of settings, he talked about Wittenberg as a kind of a hovel where there was filth in the streets, and where the Wends, who now surrounded Wittenberg, and did not have a written language at the time, and often did not, and so could not write, but often didn't speak German, only spoke Sorbian or Wendish, were kind of like an outcast. And try to think of your own kind of setting. If ever you were in a place in the United States where there were people who just were illiterate and didn't measure up to your standards, sometimes negative remarks are made about such people. Luther's comment about the Pope was, "I am a ripe stool and the world is a giant anus and we're about to let go of each other." I mean, the man who gave us justification also spoke sometimes like a boor, but very common in his language. The big question is, did everybody speak like that?
Probably.
Or was it just Luther? Did scholars speak like that? Or was it just Luther? Those are interesting questions. Luther was on the side of those who spoke crudely more frequently than his scholarly debaters. Was it because he grew up as the son of a coal miner or a man who owned a couple of coal mines? Hans? What was language like in Hans's house? I don't know. We know very little about Hans. Luther had a brother, Jacob. And at certain points in his life, he and Jacob got together, and they seem to have been good friends throughout their lives. And there were apparently a couple of 3 sisters also in the family, and we don't know how many others. But what did the family speak like in Luther's home? He said things about the Jews which get worse than this, and of the Pope. Luther never met the Pope personally, but he was in that world in which the Pope lived and decreed, and he said things about him that were crude indeed. I think it's an interesting question, and many people are saying this as a result of the Second World War, as a result of everything that Hitler and his minions used to challenge the Jews based on writings of Luther, whether Luther was a racist. I am one of those who debate that, who challenge that, but we'll look at that in just a moment. Much of that you can just read for yourself. It gives us 2 sides of Luther, the scholar, the man who wrote 120 books, or about whom 120 books were written, might be a broader way to say it. But he regarded, and why would I even be interested in that? I got interested in that because the people who surrounded me in Texas had roots among the Wends. And they were troubled by the fact that Luther, who was a kind of hero for them, had said negative things about their people. And they wondered why. So I began to research that and write it, and I've written a lot of stuff about that. Mostly to say that Luther regarded those as illiterate boors. And yet, they went on to say, we want the Reformation among us just like the German-speaking people do. We're going to send our Wendish students to Wittenberg to study. The dean of students at Wittenberg became Caspar Peuker. I reminded Dr. Wengert of that when he was here, that in this new book that he's writing about the Reformation, I hope he gives place to Caspar Peuker, because he was the dean of the students at Wittenberg. And gradually they began to graduate more and more pastors who went out speaking to their illiterate congregations of Wends. If Luther had lived long enough, he would have had to rethink some of the things that he said about the Wends. Jan Malling says this: Luther's comments are better understood not as prejudice, condescension, or racism, so much as hastily concocted street talk, peppered with slang and humor, rather than as intellectual formulation. That's a high-sounding paragraph, and we know Jan Malling rather well, and he's a highly respected Sorb Wend in Europe today, and would want to say something like that. But I like this one even more. Heiko Obermann is a renowned Reformation scholar, historian, And he says what I love. Modern analysts rob Luther's abuse of language of its significance if it is simply written off as bad breeding. Luther was a theologian, and as such he was not fighting against ethnic minorities and subclasses, but against principalities and powers, against Satan and his minions. Two-fistedly, he occasionally snatched a hand street talk to make his points. He was not going to give the devil his due because the kingdom was at stake. I like that very much because when I listened to the hymns this morning and the lessons and the sermon, it's very clear that for Luther, the Reformation era was a battle. There was a war going on. And he was fighting in his own way with those who opposed him, and he used everything he had at hand to do it. I could confess that there have been times in my life, if I was so angry about something that I let loose with some statements or phrases or comments which were not kosher. And nevertheless, and there's a man who's raising a question, Dan.
When Martin Luther called for people to burn the synagogues and the houses of the Jews, and to take away their money, and to take their kids out of school, and to put them to work, and to do those sorts of things, that seems to me to be a little more than street talk.
Okay.
And the fact that his home church has a picture on the side of the building of a pig with a bunch of rabbis suckling on it, again, that seems to be, you said sometimes you say things that aren't kosher. I think that was, as you said, used, and when you're told to burn synagogues and people's homes, that seems to me more than not being kosher.
Good, thank you for bringing that up, and we're coming to that as fast as I can get to it. So, thank you. I'd like to read this very positive statement about the Jews, and then I'd like to read what Luther said 20 years later. And I'd like to ask you, Dan, how you think he got from one place to the other. So, if I had been a Jew and had seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would sooner have become a hog than a Christian. They have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property. When they baptize them, they show them nothing of Christian doctrine or life, but only subject them to popishness and mockery. If the apostles, who were also Jews, had dealt with us Gentiles as we Gentiles deal with the Jews, there would never have been a Christian among the Gentiles. And to finish that paragraph, when we are inclined to boast of our position as Christians, we should remember that we are but Gentiles, while the Jews are of the lineage of Christ. We are aliens and in-laws. They are blood relatives, cousins, and brothers of our Lord. Therefore, if this is to boast of flesh and blood, the Jews are actually nearer to Christ than we are. If we really want to help them, we must be guided in our dealings with them, not by papal law, but by the law of Christian love. We must receive them cordially and permit them to trade and work with us, that they may have occasion and opportunity to associate with us, hear our Christian teaching, and witness our Christian life. If some of them should prove stiff-necked, what of it? The Pauline word. After all, we ourselves are not all good Christians either. Written in that Jesus Christ was born in June 1523. Now, the question is, how did Luther get from that 20 years later to this? Here in Wittenberg in our parish, and that's exactly what you were referring to, the Judensaal, there is a sow, that's a picture of it, carved into the stone was made 100 years before Luther's time, actually 1300. Carved into the stone under which lie young pigs and Jews who are sucking. Behind the sow stands a rabbi who is lifting up the right leg of the sow, raises behind the sow, bows down and looks with great effort into the Talmud under the sow, as if he wanted to read and see something most difficult and exceptional. No doubt they gained their Shem Hamphora from that place. There's a wonderful article about that, by the way, in the Smithsonian, October 2020. The article attempts to explain what's happened with respect to that particular stone, which is way high up in the back end of the church. Because there's been a great controversy in Germany as to whether that stone should be taken down because of what it shows. And the German parliament decided it would not remove it because it's a part of history. This is an enormous teaching as far as I'm concerned regarding a lot of things that we do in our country when we tear stuff down because we think it speaks negatively about a certain era. History is history. And so the parliament in Germany said we will leave that there because it has its own time and place, offensive as it is, to see that today and to have people think.
Question, what year was that carved?
That was carved in the 1300s. I don't know exactly.
1300.
So not only that carving, but that kind of thing predates Luther by centuries. Right. And so Luther was a part of that. He said things which people around him had been saying for centuries, offensive as that may be. So when we think about the things that Luther said, and I've only shared some things with you because that kind of negative speech, crude speech, goes on and on and on, not just about the Jews, but about the Pope, about his own colleagues. Luther was a man of not few words. He was a man of many words. He was verbose. The fact that so much of what he said can be put down in 6 volumes of table talk is interesting because that becomes in itself a kind of a controversy because the people who wrote that stuff down from what he said at breakfast, can that be trusted over against what some scholar wrote or what Luther himself wrote? That's a debate of its own. But let's just think about that for a moment and from your various perspectives, what do you think about selected comments that one can make from Luther? Do they overthrow his larger witness? What helps to set offensive remarks and views from a person in context? So if we have a larger context for what Luther wrote, what does that have to say about some of the things he also said? And in what sense were Luther's views theological and not racist? Let me make a couple of comments about that. Racism is something we struggle with in our society very much. And we know that it has something to do with the color of a person's skin. It has something to do with a person's heritage. It has something to do, if you talk like Hitler, with a person's chromosomes and a person's physical composition. Is Luther really speaking from that perspective? I think Luther spoke when he talked about the Jews primarily as a theologian, because Luther had this naive view that once people came to understand that the gospel in its power could be embraced by anyone, he certainly thought that Roman Catholics would flock to accept the gospel, and the Jews would as well. The Jews did not seems to have made him angry in irrational ways. And so Luther never said things about the Jews as negatively as he did when the realities began to sink in on him, and he came to understand that the Jews were not about to accept the gospel. And so he said things which he should not have said, but were probably not, if you use a definition of racism that I would use, were not racist, but were nevertheless poor theology. Now, a whole topic could be spent on discussing Luther's view of supersessionism, which he would have said Paul accepted, and that is the idea that Christ has replaced any kind of role that the Jewish people had with God, and we have a new relationship through Christ with God. That's what supersessionism is, and Luther was clearly a supersessionist who believed that if the Jews were not going to accept Christ, then they were abandoned by God. The discussion of that and the current position of the church is a debate that goes on in circles. So that's worth a whole discussion by itself. But I think Luther's view of the Jews was based on a supersessionist view, and as a result, the things that he said, while negative and crude, nevertheless were theological more than they were racist. So anything that you'd like to explore about this rather wide-ranging topic, I would encourage you to do. And if you want to come back to the Judenschau, for example, that stands on Wittenberg St. Mary's Church today, raising lots of questions for tourists and for residents. Don?
Dave, which Jews did he dislike, the Sephardim or the Ashkenazim? And there's a big difference.
But I think in his, number one, in his part of the world, he was not dealing with Sephardim, he was dealing with Ashkenazi who were in Western Europe. So what was going on in Spain, he would not have had a lot of contact with that.
Yeah, for all of the folks here, the Ashkenazim emigrated through the Caucasus Mountains and assimilated, these are the original Hebrews, assimilated with Eastern European and Central Asian peoples. And their language was Yiddish,
Right.
where the Sephardim spoke Hebrew and came through Spain up through that area.
Sephardic.
Okay. Other thoughts about what to do with this? So when your neighbor says to you, "You are a Lutheran, do you know that Martin Luther said things about the Jews which are absolutely appalling?" You would say, "Oh yeah, I know all that. It's one of the things you should say." But what other kinds of things might we say?
I guess I'd say, do you think Martin Luther would be saying that today? Do you think Martin Luther would be saying that today?
What do you think?
Or would he have kind of cleaned up his act a bit to fit in?
In my living room. I wish I knew whether Katie sometimes said to him, "Martin, don't talk that way in my home."
I bet she did.
One of the wonderful topics that we might have sometime in a class like this would be Martin Luther's love letters to Katie.
Do they exist?
Oh my.
Yeah.
Is there?
If you ever think that this crude man who had a foul mouth could have said loving, beautiful things to a woman or to anyone, you need to read Martin Luther's love letters to Katie. That is worth a session sometime. Beautiful letters.
Yeah, there's a book in the library, it's called My Kitty.
Ah, okay.
My kitty,
My Kitty.
my kitty.
Kitty.
For Katie. For Katie.
Yeah.
I think it
Yes,
would,
ma'am.
I think it would be a good idea for us to mention that in 2021, the ELCA apologized for the second time for Luther's teachings on the Jews. They did it in 1994, and then they reiterated that 2 years ago.
Good point.
And I just was going to add, on December 3rd, I'm going to do a class on did Luther read Paul correctly or not.
Oh, well, you're gonna bring up that very issue.
Yeah, but I do think there was a great sense of disappointment. He thought when he translated the Bible into German that the Jews would convert, and when they didn't, I think it made him angry, disappointed, frustrated. And it's important for us to remember that we don't have a pope, and that Luther doesn't pretend to be perfect, and he made mistakes just like the rest of us.
On the question of the whens and the serps, I've been reading about the American Revolution and how the British hired the whens to be basically mercenaries to fight with the British in this country. Is that something that you've encountered, or is that apocryphal? They were known as fighters.
The problem with that statement is that there are too many people who were called Wen, Serbs, Sorbs,
Yeah.
and I'm not quite sure what group that was speaking of. The Wens per se were not known as fighters. I knew a Danish theologian who once told me, "Oh, we are products of the Wends, we Danes." Well, that was a different kind of Wendishness. So the Sorbs were isolated in eastern Germany along the Polish corridor, and their ethnic heritage goes back well, 1500s probably, and if you try to trace it back further than that, you get mixed up with all kinds of Slavic divisions that are hard to break down. So I
I know
don't.
they were artistic and had beautiful poetic
An article that I did not long ago in
sensibilities and
the
Texas.
magazine called The Hymn, a journal of congregational song, I was attempting to prove that Johann Krieger, German name, and writer of the first generation of Lutheran hymnody that came about, the music, not the words, was not a German at all, but he was Jan Krieger, a Sorb. And much to the delight of the Sorbs, that article tells what the truth is, even though all along it was thought that he was just another one of the great German composers. Okay, yes ma'am.
I have been a member of a Missouri Synod church for the past 40 years. I have never heard any of this. So that makes me think that they're picking and choosing, just like Luther accused the Catholic Church of doing, what they impart to their members. And that's really why I've been coming here for a year and a half. But we also have a good friend who is a Lutheran pastor, Missouri Synod, who denies that the Jewish Holocaust actually happened to that extent. So I think they go and they take what appeals to them and lean on that and forget the rest. And that's so disheartening to me.
Well, I thank you for bringing that up. On the one hand, I've been a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod all my life, so I know something about that history. I would say it is not a matter of they're trying to dissuade the membership from knowing the truth. I think that in general, if something is negative, we tend not to talk about it. And even in the ELCA, we have not talked about this until more recent years, when some decisions were made to denounce what Luther said about the Jews. Many Lutheran scholars in Europe say that there are theological issues involved here, which we ought to debate at some length. But I don't think that the LCMS would take a stand on the view that Luther never said those things, or certainly never, that the Holocaust never took place. That's an individual's position. And he may be a pastor, but that's his view, and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod as a whole has never taken that kind of a view, that the Holocaust didn't take place.
Play Luther for me, okay, Martin? I'm
Okay.
gonna ask you to play Luther. How would you feel if that document that sits in St. John's Cathedral here in Milwaukee, signed by the Lutherans and Catholics, as was done in Sweden, to come together to celebrate union in belief on justification by faith? And Luther would come out of the grave, would he be crying with tears of joy to see the Lutherans and the Catholics overcoming their differences? Luther, are you crying or are you angry?
Ja, ich weine nicht. I taught a course one time at...
Answer my question. This is a deputation.
I taught a course one time.
Yeah.
And in that course, I said that it would be good if the Lutherans and Catholics would be of one mind and one spirit and one heart. But it is not happening in my time, and I am angry about it.
Did he ever want to break the church in two?
9.
9. Das ist richtig.
But to your point, a good point, I taught a course one time at Concordia University in Austin, Texas. And it was about the joint declaration between the Lutherans and the Catholics. And one student stood up at that class, and he was the husband of the treasurer of the university. And he said, you should not be taking that kind of a position, because the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod does not agree with the joint declaration.
Oh, yeah.
Which was not signed between the ELCA and the Catholics, but between the Lutheran World Federation and the Catholics. Hence the picture of Martin Junge that we had on here. So, but it is true that the ELCA came to accept that position, and that the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has never officially accepted that position regarding the common understanding of justification that should be held by these two church bodies, the Catholics, the Catholics or the Lutherans.
We had the Luther scholar Mickey Maddox speak here a number of years ago. Does anyone remember this? And he was asked a similar question, and his response was, if Luther were alive today, he would be Catholic. That was not a very popular response here. And people got really angry, and Mickey no longer teaches at Marquette. He converted to Catholicism and now teaches in Michigan. But he was a member here, and we asked him, he was asked that question. He also said if he were here, there would be a picture of the Mother Mary throughout the church as well, because he respected her a great deal, and that she's not. But it was just funny to hear that sort of perspective, which would be, I take, very different from yours.
Yes.
Just one comment, if you're, für Ihren ausführlichen Bericht, ihr gebt unser herzlichen Danken. I'll translate that. For your wonderful report, we give our heartfelt thanks.
Well, we've come to the end of our hour, so thank you for coming.
Rabbi.